The story surrounding comedian Katt Williams had always been one marked by chaos, controversy, and unpredictability. For years, he was the kind of entertainer who thrived on shock value, an eccentric performer whose antics offstage seemed to mirror, if not outshine, his scripted performances. Yet, even in a career filled with countless scandals and a reputation for finding trouble, no one could have predicted the bombshell that had now erupted. This time, the headlines weren't about a public meltdown, a bizarre press conference, or an ill-tempered outburst. No, this time, the news was darker, far more sinister. Katt Williams, the man once known for turning controversy into comedy, now found his name entangled in a full-fledged murder investigation. The spark for this scandal began with a federal raid that shook the entertainment world. Agents stormed the tour bus of fellow comedian Manique, a respected and outspoken figure in Hollywood whose name rarely appeared in connection to crime or scandal. The raid was not random, it was the result of a tip-off linked to the shocking murder of a rising star in comedy, Reggie Carroll. The connection between Carroll's death and Williams' presence on the same tour immediately set social media and news outlets ablaze. For many, it seemed like the plot of a thriller: federal agents raiding a tour bus, an emerging comic gun down in Mississippi, and one of Hollywood's most controversial comedians sitting squarely in the center of the storm. To understand how it all unraveled, one must revisit Williams' long history of entanglements. He was not a stranger to law enforcement or headlines. Years prior, the comedian had been caught on video brawling with a seventh grader, a surreal image that came to define his chaotic public persona. He had made headlines for verbal tirades at press conferences, outbursts on stage, and feuds with fellow celebrities. Over time, it became clear that Williams was not simply a comic but a spectacle, a man whose career existed in a strange balance between genius and disaster. For his fans, that unpredictability was part of his appeal, but for critics, it painted him as a man spiraling out of control. And yet, even against such a turbulent backdrop, the allegations linking him to Reggie Carroll's murder felt almost unthinkable. Carroll had been a comedian on the rise, a performer whose energy and ambition were beginning to earn him recognition. His tragic death sent shockwaves through the industry. But when whispers began to circulate that Katt Williams, of all people, might somehow be involved, or at least connected through those around him, the story escalated into something beyond tabloid fodder. It became a question of whether the chaos Williams cultivated for so long had finally crossed into something deadly. The details of the investigation only deepened the intrigue. Reports claimed that federal agents discovered documents and items of interest during their raid on Manique's tour bus, items that allegedly connected the murder of Carroll to individuals within Williams' orbit. What exactly those files contained remained unclear, but rumors of financial dealings, suspicious meetings, and unexplained transactions quickly surfaced. For investigators, this raised the question: was Williams merely caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was there a darker undercurrent to his presence on the tour? At the center of suspicion was Williams' own security guard, a man named Tral Morris Williams. According to sources, Tral was more than just hired protection. He was a trusted figure within the comedian's inner circle, a person tasked with safeguarding him amid the chaos of touring life. Yet now, this bodyguard found himself accused of being involved in Carroll's murder. The revelation left many stunned. How could someone so close to Williams, someone charged with defending him, become linked to such a violent crime? Was this the result of a situation spiraling out of control, or was there something calculated about it? Theories quickly multiplied. Some suggested that Carroll's presence on the tour had created tension. As a comedian on the rise, perhaps his growing popularity clashed with the ego and volatility of those already established. Others speculated about financial disputes or personal grudges. In the combustible world of entertainment, where fame, money, and rivalry constantly collide, any number of sparks could ignite conflict. And with Williams at the center, a man whose brand was built on living at the edge of chaos, it seemed inevitable that speculation would place him closer to the fire. For those who had followed Williams' career, none of this was entirely surprising. His life had been one long parade of scandals, each new incident overshadowing the last. Yet the murder investigation elevated everything to a new, unsettling level. This was not about public brawls or erratic interviews. This was about life and death. If proven true, the implications would not only end his career, but dismantle the empire he had built through years of controversy. If false, it still left a permanent stain, another chapter in a life that seemed destined to be defined by headlines. Adding further complexity was the presence of Manique. Known for her candor and fearless critiques of Hollywood, she had never been one to shy away from confrontation. Yet in this case, her tour bus had become the focal point of a federal raid, raising questions about her role. Was she simply caught in the crossfire, a bystander in an investigation that happened to overlap with her tour? Or did she know more than she was letting on? For her fans, the idea that Manique could be complicit was unthinkable. But in a story already filled with twists, no possibility could be easily dismissed. The public reaction was swift and divided. Williams' supporters argued that he was being unfairly targeted, the victim of a system eager to punish him for his outspokenness and eccentricity. To them, the investigation was just another attempt to tear down a man who had built a career by defying Hollywood norms. Critics, however, pointed to his long history of trouble as evidence that this was simply the culmination of years of reckless behavior. The question was no longer whether Williams thrived in chaos, but whether he had finally been consumed by it. As the investigation pressed on, one truth became increasingly clear. This was no ordinary celebrity scandal. The involvement of federal agents, the discovery of documents, and the direct connection to a murder case placed it in an entirely different category. For Williams, the stakes had never been higher. For his fans, the story was both shocking and tragically predictable. And for the industry, it was a reminder of how quickly fame, fortune, and notoriety could unravel into disaster. By the time news of the raid and the arrest began to circulate widely, the story had already transcended comedy. It was no longer about one man's antics or even one tragic crime. It had become a symbol of the blurred line between performance and reality, between spectacle and self-destruction. Williams, once celebrated for turning breakdowns into punchlines, now faced a narrative that was anything but funny. The world watched, waiting for answers. Was he a mastermind or merely caught in a storm he could not control? Was the chaos he had built his brand upon finally catching up to him? Or was he being pulled into a conspiracy beyond his making? One thing was certain: the Katt Williams saga was far from over. As the investigation deepened, the puzzle surrounding Katt Williams grew more complex, with each revelation raising more questions than it answered. The raid on Manique's tour bus had been shocking enough, but the aftermath revealed that authorities were not merely chasing rumors. They were following a trail of evidence, and that trail led directly into Williams' circle. For fans, the idea of their favorite comedian becoming entangled in a murder probe felt surreal. Yet, for investigators, the pieces were starting to form a disturbing picture. The central point of tension was the alleged role of Williams' bodyguard, Trell Morris Williams. Once considered a trusted protector, he was now the prime suspect in the killing of Reggie Carroll. That fact alone sent shockwaves through both the comedy world and the public. Security guards were supposed to safeguard their employers, not plunge them into scandal. For years, Trowell had been by Katt's side, part of the entourage that traveled city to city, managing the volatility that seemed to follow the comedian everywhere. But now, whispers of betrayal and criminal involvement painted him as a liability rather than a shield. Documents seized during the federal raid reportedly tied Trowell to financial dealings that investigators found suspicious. Anonymous sources suggested that these files contained records of secret meetings, unexplained cash transfers, and communications that hinted at something more sinister than ordinary tour logistics. If the leaks were to be believed, these documents placed both Trowell and, by extension, Katt Williams closer to the murder than anyone had initially suspected. For a man whose life was already an endless parade of scandals, this was a step into truly dangerous territory. The deeper issue, however, was the environment surrounding Williams. His career had always existed on the razor's edge of chaos. Tour life with him was described by insiders as unpredictable, high-tension, and at times, toxic. Arguments, sudden cancellations, fights, and drama were common occurrences. For someone like Reggie Carroll, a young comedian eager to make a name for himself, stepping into this world may have been both an opportunity and a risk. Carroll was reportedly ambitious, sharp-witted, and unwilling to back down. That combination made him a potential star, but also, in the wrong setting, a target. Speculation soon swirled that Carroll's death might not have been random at all. Rumors suggested he had clashed with members of the tour, possibly even with Katt himself. While nothing concrete had been confirmed, whispers of rivalry and resentment painted a picture of growing tension behind the scenes. Could Carroll's rising popularity have threatened others in Williams' circle? Or was there something more personal at play, an altercation or grudge that escalated into violence? The lack of official answers only fueled public fascination and suspicion. Meanwhile, Manique's unexpected involvement in the story added another layer of intrigue. Known for her honesty and outspoken criticism of Hollywood, she had long been a figure who refused to play by the industry's rules. Yet, the fact that her bus had been raided suggested that investigators believed she was closer to the scandal than anyone anticipated. Was she simply an unfortunate bystander whose property had been caught in the crossfire? Or was she privy to the shadowy dealings that tied Katt Williams and his entourage to Carroll's murder? Public opinion was split. Some insisted Manique was a victim of circumstance, while others began questioning whether her association with Williams had drawn her into something darker than she realized. Katt Williams himself remained an enigma. On one hand, his defenders pointed to the lack of direct evidence linking him to the crime. They argued that the authorities were merely targeting him because of his notoriety, eager to pin guilt on a man with a reputation for chaos. On the other hand, skeptics highlighted his history of poor decisions, volatile relationships, and a pattern of surrounding himself with questionable figures. To them, it was not surprising that his inner circle might be implicated in something criminal. Whether he was directly involved or not, they argued, Williams had created the kind of environment where violence and scandal were almost inevitable. Adding fuel to the fire were leaked reports of financial irregularities tied to Williams' ventures. Beyond comedy, he had tried to expand into clothing lines, public appearances, and other business pursuits. Some insiders claimed that the documents seized during the raid pointed to corruption, bribes, shell companies, or suspicious money transfers. If true, this meant the scandal extended beyond a single crime, reaching into the foundations of Williams' empire. Was his career not only built on chaos, but also on a network of shady dealings? Or were these merely exaggerated claims designed to amplify the drama? For the public, the story became less about one crime and more about the unraveling of a persona. Williams had long been known as Hollywood's master of controversy, a comedian who could turn a meltdown into a performance and chaos into currency. But this time, his brand of unpredictability was not a laughing matter. Murder was no punchline, and the evidence piling up suggested this was no ordinary scandal. The federal government did not raid tour buses without reason, and the seriousness of the investigation made it clear that this was not going to vanish with a simple apology or a cleverly timed comeback. Industry insiders began to weigh in, and the reactions revealed just how polarizing Williams had become. Some comedians defended him, insisting that he was a victim of circumstance, a misunderstood genius whose eccentricity was being twisted into something criminal. Others, however, distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the growing storm. The comedy community, already known for rivalries and sharp divisions, now seemed split between those who believed in his innocence and those convinced he had finally crossed a line from chaos into crime. Beyond the industry, fans wrestled with their own conflicting emotions. Many had followed Williams for years, drawn to his raw honesty and his refusal to conform. They laughed at his wild rants, marveled at his ability to turn scandal into art, and forgave his countless missteps. But now, the laughter was harder to find. Even if Williams were not guilty, the mere association with a murder case stained his legacy. It forced fans to confront the uncomfortable question of whether the chaos they had always celebrated had, in the end, become destructive. The media, for its part, fed the frenzy. Headlines screamed about Katt Williams and murder, turning each new rumor into breaking news. Talk shows debated his guilt, podcasts dissected every leak, and social media exploded with conspiracy theories. Some believed Williams was a scapegoat, targeted because of his outspoken nature and past conflicts with Hollywood. Others saw him as a manipulative figure, orchestrating drama behind the scenes while projecting an image of unpredictability. Either way, the narrative grew larger than life, blurring the line between reality and spectacle. As the weeks passed, the question of what really happened to Reggie Carroll only became more pressing. Who stood to gain from his death? Why had the tour bus been raided with such urgency? And most importantly, what role, if any, had Williams played in this tragedy? The silence from authorities only deepened the mystery, leaving room for endless speculation. With every unanswered question, the story became less about facts and more about interpretation, a kind of real-life thriller unfolding in slow motion. For Williams, the consequences loomed large. Even if cleared of direct involvement, the damage to his reputation was immense. Sponsors grew wary, projects stalled, and the public began to doubt whether he could ever reclaim his place on stage without the shadow of scandal following him. For Manique, the raid cast a cloud over her tour, raising questions she may never have anticipated. And for Reggie Carroll, the young comedian whose life had been cut short, the truth of what happened still hung in uncertainty, overshadowed by the spectacle that followed. In the end, Section 2 of this saga painted a picture not of answers, but of deepening shadows. The murder investigation was no longer a single thread. It was a tangled web connecting comedy, crime, money, and fame. Katt Williams stood at the center, a man who had built an empire on chaos, now facing the possibility that chaos might be his undoing. By the time the case reached its third act, the situation around Katt Williams had grown into something far larger than a celebrity scandal. What began as whispers of controversy had morphed into a national obsession, complete with federal investigations, conspiracy theories, and a string of unanswered questions. Each passing day brought new headlines, and each headline seemed more dramatic than the last. What the public wanted most, clarity, remained frustratingly out of reach. The deeper one looked into the case, the murkier it seemed to become. At the heart of the storm was the unsolved murder of Reggie Carroll, a young comedian whose potential was only beginning to be recognized. Carroll's rise in the comedy world had been marked by energy, ambition, and a knack for connecting with audiences. His tragic death shocked not only his fans but also his peers, leaving an air of injustice that demanded explanation. Yet the more investigators probed, the more tangled the narrative became, with Williams and his entourage always at the center. The involvement of Trall Morris Williams, Katt's longtime bodyguard, remained a pivotal element. Law enforcement sources hinted that Trall's alleged role in Carroll's death might have stemmed from tensions that had been simmering during the tour. Insiders whispered about heated arguments, personal grudges, and a hostile environment that had escalated beyond repair. For investigators, the question was simple but crucial. Was Trall acting alone, or was he carrying out orders from someone higher up? In other words, was this the act of a rogue individual, or part of a larger conspiracy? If Trall were guilty, it placed Katt Williams in an uncomfortable position. Even if the comedian had no direct involvement, the fact that his closest security detail was implicated raised serious concerns about the company he kept. More damning still were the documents seized during the raid on Manique's bus. Though their full contents were never publicly revealed, reports suggested that they pointed toward deeper financial irregularities, transactions that hinted at corruption, cover-ups, and perhaps even motives for silencing someone like Carroll. Whether those documents directly tied Williams himself to the crime was unclear, but the association was enough to drag his name through the mud. For the comedy community, the scandal was both tragic and unsettling. Reggie Carroll had been considered a bright light, a fresh voice in an industry hungry for new talent. His death became a grim reminder of the darker undercurrents that sometimes lurked behind the laughter. Comedians spoke out on podcasts and interviews, some defending Williams, others demanding accountability. The community seemed divided, but all agreed on one point: the tragedy had cast a long shadow over their world. Manique's role in the saga also remained a matter of heated debate. She had built her reputation on honesty and fearlessness, never hesitating to call out injustices in Hollywood. Yet the fact that her bus had been raided placed her directly in the crosshairs of public speculation. Some argued that she was merely collateral damage, her property used by others for purposes she knew nothing about. Others wondered whether she had unknowingly or knowingly allowed herself to become part of a dangerous network. Her silence following the raid was interpreted in conflicting ways. To some, it was the quiet dignity of an innocent person waiting for truth to prevail. To others, it was a sign that she had more to hide than she was letting on. Meanwhile, Katt Williams himself became a walking paradox. Publicly, he maintained a defiant posture, hinting at conspiracies and framing himself as a target of systemic efforts to bring him down. His long history of railing against the entertainment industry gave weight to his claims among loyal fans, who saw him as a victim of Hollywood's punishment machine. Yet outside his fanbase, skepticism grew. Was this really just another instance of Williams exaggerating his victimhood? Or was there truth to his insistence that forces larger than himself were orchestrating his downfall? The media frenzy surrounding the case only added fuel to the fire. Talk shows debated the evidence, social media dissected every rumor, and conspiracy theories flourished online. Some believed Carroll had stumbled onto secrets he wasn't meant to know, making him a target. Others insisted that Williams' erratic behavior and controversial circle had simply set the stage for tragedy. In either case, the story was no longer just about one man's guilt or innocence. It had become a reflection of how fame, money, and chaos intersect in ways that can turn deadly. As the investigation dragged on, the legal implications became impossible to ignore. Williams faced mounting pressure, not only from law enforcement, but also from the collapse of his public image. Shows were cancelled, sponsors backed away, and business ventures crumbled under the weight of scandal. Even if he were eventually cleared of direct involvement, the damage to his reputation seemed irreversible. He had always thrived on controversy, but now controversy was threatening to destroy him. For Williams fans, the experience was deeply conflicted. On one hand, many remained fiercely loyal, clinging to the belief that he was being unfairly targeted. They pointed to his history of calling out corruption in Hollywood, framing the investigation as retaliation. On the other hand, even the most dedicated supporters could not ignore the gravity of the allegations. A murder investigation was not the same as a tabloid feud or a public brawl. It forced fans to confront the uncomfortable possibility that their idol's chaos had crossed into something unforgivable. The unanswered questions only deepened the sense of unease. Why had Carroll been targeted? Why had documents of interest been found on Manique's bus? Was Williams complicit, negligent, or merely unlucky? Each possibility carried its own weight, and none provided a sense of closure. For the public, it became less about finding answers and more about watching the drama unfold. The story had transformed into a kind of tragic entertainment, with Williams cast as both protagonist and villain in a real-life crime thriller. Behind all the spectacle, however, remained the undeniable reality. A young comedian had lost his life. Carroll's murder was not a punchline, nor a subplot in Williams' ongoing saga. It was a tragedy that demanded justice, no matter how tangled the circumstances. For his family and friends, the endless speculation and media circus only added to the pain. While the world obsessed over Williams' reputation, they mourned a life cut short, a future stolen, and a legacy overshadowed by scandal. As Section 3 of this unfolding saga revealed, the case against Katt Williams was not simply about guilt or innocence. It was about the larger consequences of living a life built on chaos. For years, Williams had turned controversy into art, drama into profit, and unpredictability into a brand. But in doing so, he had surrounded himself with volatility, enemies, and questionable figures. Whether or not he had played an active role in Carroll's death, the environment he fostered had become the perfect breeding ground for tragedy. In the end, the story of Katt Williams and the murder of Reggie Carroll remained unfinished, an open-ended mystery that captivated the public, but devastated those closest to the victim. Perhaps the truth would one day come to light, exposing the real motives and the real culprits. Or perhaps the case would remain forever shrouded in speculation, another unsolved chapter in the long, chaotic saga of a man who built his career on unpredictability. One fact, however, was undeniable. Katt Williams would never escape this shadow. Whether as a mastermind, a scapegoat, or a victim of his own choices, he had become forever tied to one of the darkest scandals in comedy history. For him, for Manique, for Trell, and for Carroll, the consequences of this tangled web would resonate long after the headlines faded.